So thank you to Professor Christopher Fletcher at the University of Waterloo this morning for joining us. Welcome to MERL Seminar Series. And thank you for talking about such an interesting topic. So today we're going to hear Chris talk about harnessing machine learning to build better Earth system models for climate projection. I believe that both for Mitsubishi Electric Corporation as well as MERL, this is a topic that is of deep, both personal and for some of us professional interest as well. So again, thank you for this very interesting topic. With that, let me just run a short bio of Chris. So Chris, I met Chris actually at the ICML this year, where you were giving the plenary talk on climate modeling, and it was a very interesting talk. And we followed up after that and talked about some directions we could work on together. So Chris is a climate scientist and contributing author to the 6th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report. His research group at the University of Waterloo focuses on improving the development, calibration, and application of Earth's level system models, and on how satellite remote sensing can be used to monitor climate in cold regions. Currently funded projects investigate the benefit of applying machine learning techniques in both of these aspects of climate science. And I suppose today's talk will cover a lot of that. So without further ado, please, the floor is all yours, Chris, and go for it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Ankush, and to Gordon as well for this kind invitation to speak to you today. I'm just going to share my screen, prepared some slides to support the points that I'm going to be making. Maybe let me know if you can't see that properly, but I'll assume that you can. So
I'm seeing a green screen, Chris, so maybe yeah, okay. Just give us a second. Is that just me? Gordon, can you see the slides?
Yeah, I can see the slides fine.
Oh, okay, so it's just me. All right, go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks. So I just wanted to kind of motivate my talk today with this really kind of beautiful image here, taken from a contribution in the last year or so in the James Journal. And this sort of shows the nature of the problem, right? So this is the global climate system in all its glory. You can see clouds, the kind of bright white parts. If you squint and look carefully, there's also dust in here, aerosol particulates in the atmosphere, snow and ice in the northern latitudes, and ocean and land. So everything's in here. And this looks remarkably like a satellite image of the Earth, but it's not. Actually, this is the output from a very high resolution simulation of a global weather and climate model. And to all intents and purposes, this is basically the target. Okay, this is kind of what we're trying to achieve and what we're striving toward. And I'll show some images shortly of kind of the state of the science of where we are right now. And I'm going to try and make the argument in the next kind of 40 minutes or so that we need to improve the Earth system modeling tools that we as climate scientists have at our disposal. And the argument that I'm going to try and put forward today is that machine learning can be part of the toolkit that might help us as climate scientists to achieve this goal of developing and using very high resolution Earth system modeling tools. I'm going to present 2 case studies from work that we have published or are about to publish on this topic. And that work, could not have been performed without my co-authors, Will McNally and Jack Virgin, our PhD students at the University of Waterloo. Baka Badawi was a postdoc working with me at the University of Waterloo for 2 years and is now a scientist at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I'd like to acknowledge the funding for this work through NSERC, which is like the Canadian version of NSF, and Microsoft's Artificial Intelligence for Good or for Earth program through the AI Institute at Waterloo. Okay, so here's a picture of the sort of current state of the art in terms of projections of future climate change for the full kind of global picture here. And these projections are produced by Earth system models that were run in a coordinated sense by different modeling centers around the world for the most recent IPCC assessment report, the AR6, which actually just came out last summer. So here what you're seeing is a fairly well-known picture, at least to people used to looking at climate change problems. So this is the picture of localized warming in different parts of the world over land and ocean at a fixed level of global warming. So the global average warming in this picture is 2 degrees C, and we expect that to be reached sometime in the sort of mid to late 21st century. But as you can see, you know, the spatial detail of this pattern of warming is quite rich, right? So land areas tend to warm more than ocean. Higher latitude areas, particularly over the Arctic, tend to warm more than lower latitude ones. And so in order to capture and reproduce all of these kind of rich features of the response to climate change, which are even more pronounced when we look at a variable like precipitation here on the right, we need Earth system models. Okay, we cannot at this point produce this type of projection with quantitative information and the full physically consistent nature of the climate response using any other tool. Okay, so we need physics-based Earth system models to produce these types of projections and quantitative information to understand how rising carbon dioxide emissions will impact Earth's climate into the future. And the main reason for that, of course, is that we're pushing the climate system through human activities outside of the range of what has been observed previously. So data-driven models on their own are unlikely to be, and at this point can't be, the only tool. We need these physics-based models. So what are Earth system models? I wanted to do a kind of very basic introduction to these tools. I'm going to be saying this term Earth system model a lot, so I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. So here's Earth again. This is a blue marble. This is now a satellite image of Earth looking at North America. And, you know, here's all the richness and the complexity again. And of course, as many of you on the call today will know, there's just far too much complexity here to make progress in terms of numerical modeling. So as physicists, as climate scientists, what we do is the thing that we always do, which is to simplify. Okay, so here's the sort of simplified, discretized version of the sphere. And what we've done is laid down a mesh or a grid on the surface of the Earth. And the model, the Earth system model, is solving the fundamental governing equations for mass and energy and momentum in each of these grid squares, grid boxes that you see. But that's not the end of it, because of course the atmosphere and also the ocean has a vertical extent, right? So in fact the mesh is not 2D but 3D, and so each of these boxes is actually a cube, and the Earth system model is essentially the algorithm that solves for the fundamental physical quantities inside each of these cubes or boxes, and also tracks, most importantly, the movement or flux of energy, water, and momentum between the boxes at each time step. And these equations are solved approximately every 10 to 15 minutes of model time, and the model is integrated forward in time for tens or hundreds and sometimes even thousands of years. So this is an incredibly complicated and expensive set of calculations, and that's why running these Earth system models, you know, occupies many of the largest supercomputers currently in operation. So you can think of an Earth system model in the way that I like to describe Earth system models as stuff tracking algorithms, right? Because they are essentially solving for the quantities like temperature and moisture inside each of these boxes, and then tracking the movement of those things around. And the equations, of course, are solved, these PDEs at every time step, this series of equations called Navier-Stokes equations, and these form the basis of the Earth system model. So that's what the physics-based model is doing. and that's why it occupies a huge amount of computing time. Now, as many of you will have noted, the spatial grid that I showed on the previous slide, the boxes are rather large. Okay, so just to sort of orient you where we are in the current state of things, the models that were used for the IPCC the assessment report tend to have grid boxes that are about 100 kilometers on a side. Now, just by empirical observation, as you stare out of your windows, you will note that there are many features in the atmosphere, most notably clouds, that occur on spatial scales that are much smaller than 100 kilometers on the side. And so these processes are important and need to be represented in the model, but can't be represented by fundamental governing equations. And so they are represented inside each of those grid boxes by sort of pseudo equations. We call them parameterizations. These are often empirical relationships derived from available observations that can relate the large scale, so the resolved processes that the model is able to solve for from the equations, to the smaller scale processes like clouds, radiation, and convection that cannot be explicitly resolved. And so here's a list of these unresolved processes that require parameterizations in Earth system models and in numerical weather prediction models. So why is this important? Well, because we don't have fundamental governing equations for these parameterizations, and because in some cases they are developed with very few real observations to constrain them. I mean, if you think about measuring some of these cloud processes and cloud relevant quantities like the fall speed of hydrometeors like ice crystals or raindrops, some of the rates of exchange of mass and the rates of converting between liquid and ice, for example, in the cloud. These are things that vary on a very small scale. They vary between locations, and they're just really difficult to measure. So because of that, we can say with some certainty that many of these parameterizations are poorly constrained by observations. It means that they contribute large uncertainties to the model simulation. And because of these number of parameters that are labeled in this diagram here, A, B, C, D, etc., the model requires calibration, right? Like any physical model, we need to tune these parameters or tweak them in order to find the values of these parameters that produce the most reliable and the most realistic simulation. So this process of model calibration, or tuning as it's often called in climate modeling circles, is very important, but it's also potentially very expensive as well, because every time you tweak a parameter in a parameterization, you essentially have to run the model, the Earth system model, to find out what the impact of that change in the parameter is on the simulation in the model. And as I just showed you, that involves, you know, a tremendous number of calculations that is very expensive. Okay, so this sort of summarizes the introduction part of my talk, which is to say that we need high resolution Earth system models. And by high resolution, I mean sub 10 kilometer would be ideal. The image I showed on the very first title slide was a 1.4 kilometer resolution simulation. The simulations that we're running for the IPCC models right now are much more similar to this one that's shown on the upper left. This is a 200 kilometer, so slightly lower resolution. But you can see that the precipitation field in this simulation is sort of smeared out across the high topography regions of the Western US compared to what the observed distribution of precipitation looks like in the lower right. So to answer all sorts of questions related to decision making, adaptation, and especially related to water, right, to hydrologic change in future, we need high resolution Earth system models. So we have a choice, right? We've got these 100 kilometer CMIP6 or IPCC class models. And so, you know, the only way that we can use that output to get really high resolution results like this is downscaling. Okay, that's where we take the output from a low resolution model and feed it into a higher resolution model, whether or not that model is physics-based, dynamical, or it's a statistical model. There's also options for you to do that. But the problem with that is that you only downscale over a specific region, right? You don't downscale for the whole globe typically. And if, depending on the way you're doing the downscaling, there's all sorts of problems with physical inconsistencies at the boundary, and it's really a suboptimal solution. So the most optimal solution is to get global Earth system models running at high resolution everywhere in an efficient way. However, one of the first and major barriers to that development of high resolution models is in that tuning and calibration step. And this is where I see a role for machine learning, because instead of running the Earth system model itself, testing and tweaking all of the different parameters and assessing what the impact is on the output, what I will show in a couple of studies today is that you can actually run the Earth system model for relatively few instances and then use the output to train a machine learning model that can learn the behavior or the impact of the parameters on the output. Okay, and then I have one slide which hopefully will make the case that the research that's being done in the climate modeling space that involves machine learning is increasing close to exponentially. Okay, so this is a graph showing, one measure of that research intensity, publications from the Web of Science search, okay, by year. And I just, the query I entered was machine learning and climate model, and you can see the explosion in research activity in this space. So this is really gaining a lot of traction, and it's now very common at climate science conferences for there to be AI, machine learning symposia and sessions, and this is really gaining a lot of ground, which is great to see. Okay. I'm going to jump now into the first case study. This was a project that we completed in around 2017. So this was my kind of first foray into how we might be able to use machine learning to essentially short circuit or shortcut this calibration and tuning process. So this is the publication that came out of this work. Colleagues Ben Kravitz and postdoc Baka Badawi were involved, and what we tried to do here was to quantify what impact some of these uncertain parameters in the atmospheric model, what impact they have on a fundamental quantity in a climate model and an Earth system model, which is that model's sensitivity to a doubling of carbon dioxide. So that's known as the climate sensitivity of the model. And I'm going to describe what we did and what we found. First, I just want to provide again a bit of a leveling on understanding of climate sensitivity. So I think of the climate sensitivity of an Earth system model a bit like an individual's blood pressure. So the climate sensitivity of an Earth system model is a revealed property, an emergent property of that model. It's not something that's built into the Earth system model. It's something that is the result of all of the physical parameterizations and the way that the equations are solved and the resolution and all of the different facets of the model. And so it's a very useful indicator of each model. And so what you can see here on the left, this now is a figure from a seminal paper by Mark Zelinka, which describes the change in the climate sensitivity, this ECS quantity, between two generations of Earth system models. CMIP5, that's the previous generation from sort of 10 years ago, and then CMIP6, which is the current generation. And what you can see is that there is, on average, with these black circles, an increase in the mean equilibrium climate sensitivity, ECS, in these models. But you'll also see that for every individual model, which are these circles here, there is a very wide range of ECS as well. And there's lots of discussion in the community right now about whether this mean ECS is even meaningful. And in fact, it looks like you have 2 or 3 groups of models and we shouldn't be looking at the mean. I'm not going to focus on that today. What I am going to focus on is what causes variation in ECS. And I'm going to focus on it from just looking at one particular model, because here we have a whole family, a whole generation of models that are showing that ECS is a very variable quantity. So here's the family. Okay, imagine each one of these individuals is a model. And we can think again about the blood pressure analogy and say, well, what factors influence an individual's blood pressure? And you might boil it down to some kind of combination of, genes and environment, right? There might be, a genetic predisposition to a high or a low blood pressure, but there may also be factors in an individual's lifestyle or environment that can increase or decrease blood pressure as well. And so it is for Earth system models with their climate sensitivity, because there are, it turns out, structural differences in the way that the different models are constructed. And so we might think of those as being sort of genetic. And then each individual model with its different parameterizations has a combination of parameters that have been found to tune that model. We might think of those as being the sort of environmental or the lifestyle effects. And what we did in this study was to try and investigate how big of an impact you can have on one model in terms of its climate sensitivity by varying the parameters. So how big of an impact parametric uncertainty, as we call it, has on climate sensitivity. And this hadn't been demonstrated very clearly before. But what we found, if you think about this full range of climate sensitivity that you see here, for example, for the CMIP5 models, what we found is that about 25 to 30% of this range could be explained by variations in uncertain parameters. So that's a fairly sizable chunk of this spread that's not related to the different model and the different physics that are being represented. It's just related to the calibration and the tuning. Okay, briefly, what we did to address this question is we ran one particular model. So this is the NCAR Community Earth System model with its atmospheric model version 4 at a fairly low resolution. Lots more details in the paper, and I can answer questions on the specific experimental design. We ran the model in quite a simplified fashion because we had to run it a reasonably large number of times. It turned out we actually didn't need to run it this many times, but we overcompensated and ran it 350 times, each time with different combinations, excuse me, with a different combination of 9 uncertain parameters. And we ran it in a pre-industrial mode. So we did one simulation with each combination of parameters with pre-industrial sea surface temperatures. And then we ran the same combination of parameters in a future mode. And we kind of cheated. We fast forwarded to the future by just adding 2 degrees to the sea surface temperatures everywhere to simulate a global warming. And this is an experimental approach pioneered by SES and others in the 80s and 90s as a way to estimate the climate sensitivity of a model when run in this simplified form. Okay, and then we use an emulator. So we use these 350 training points as examples that we can then show to the machine learning model, and that model can map the changes in the uncertain parameters onto the changes in the outputs in the model. And in that way, we build a very cheap and efficient way of mapping out the entire parameter space and the impact on climate sensitivity from these uncertain parameters. Okay, I'm not going to go into any detail on this. The details are in the paper, but just to say that there's 2 main classes of parameter. There were aerosol parameters that we varied x1 through x4, and then there were atmospheric parameters which relate to things like clouds and convection, x5 through x9. And each of these parameters has a minimum and a maximum and a value that the default version of the model has. So each of these parameters that you see a default value for exists in the default model and has a value that was shipped from NCAR in the the public version of the code. Okay, here's a very sort of busy and detailed plot, and I'm not going to expect you to focus on the details, but just to say that we mapped out first the relationship between parameters and outputs. So we've got the different parameter values that were sampled in this kind of upper triangle of the plot, and then the relationship between each of those parameters and the output quantities like optical depth, cloud amount, precipitation, and then all the way down in the lower corner, the climate sensitivity. And you can see that the relationship between some of the parameters like X9, for example, and climate sensitivity is a sort of complex, interesting nonlinear function, whereas for others, like X5, which is a parameter that relates to cloud amount, has a fairly straightforward linear association with something like cloud, which you might expect. Okay, and the other thing I should say is that all of these outputs have been averaged over the entire globe. So we're just looking at global means in this case study. The second case study I'm going to show in a few moments, we actually start to emulate the full spatial resolution of the model. The emulator that we use, just a few words on this, because I think there are some interested members of the audience for the machine learning component of this. So the basic mathematical problem is that we would like to model the influence of a set of uncertain parameters X on some climate model outputs Y. And if, as I was already said, you're going to use the Earth system model to directly estimate Y of X, then that's going to be really expensive. Okay, so much better to use a small sample of output to train an emulator to learn this function. A very popular choice for this type of emulation problem is Gaussian processes. Okay, so this Gaussian process model can be used as a way to approximate this function, and it has some covariance function built in here. And the attractive property of the GP model is its ability to give a predicted mean and variance. So it's sort of giving a posterior estimate of its own uncertainty, which is extremely useful when you're doing uncertainty quantification. And I'll show you right now, actually, some examples of how we use that information. So this is the first results slide that contains some information from the emulator. And this was our attempt at validating how well the emulator was working. So what we've done here is a leave one out cross-validation, where for each of the 350 points, and each of these dots is a point in our training sample, we left one case out, and then we trained the GP emulator to predict the left out case. And so what's being shown here is the prediction at each of those cases when it's been left out, and its uncertainty with the gray error bar. The quantity that's shown on the left is our multivariate skill score, SS as we call it. This is a measure in a single number of the fidelity of any one simulation compared to a reference. So basically a higher SS value, closer to 1, is a simulation that is much closer to the reference than one that has a low SS. And we use this SS to essentially identify which parts of the parameter space are producing better or worse emulated models. Okay, so for SS, we're able to emulate that quantity, well, almost perfectly actually with the GP model. On the right-hand side, you can see the climate sensitivity lambda. So this is, as I mentioned, an emergent property of the model. It's not directly controlled by any one or a number of parameters. And this quantity, the emulator struggled a bit more with, but we were still relatively satisfied that this overall performance of the emulator at emulating climate sensitivity was pretty high. And the uncertainty range is also a little bit larger than you get with SS, but still we think this is adequate, and we were happy to use this tool to emulate the climate sensitivity going forward. Oh, and I should have mentioned that the truth, the actual output from the simulation is on the x-axis, and the predicted value from the GP emulator is on the y. Okay, using this GP emulator, we're also able to do some nice things, like to identify which of the parameters from our list of 9, x1 through x9, is most important for explaining variations in which of our outputs. So again, I'm focusing on these two outputs, SS, which is basically a sort of aggregated score that takes into account multiple outputs like low cloud amount and precipitation, and bundles them all into one number, and our climate sensitivity lambda. So for the skill score, you can see that the most important parameters are x5 and x9, and these have to do with low cloud amount for x5 and something to do with deep convection. So this is basically the way that parcels rise, and the potential energy within those parcels is used up by the process of generating precipitation. And the blue bars here tell us something about the main effect of each of these parameters. The gray bars tell us about the nonlinear interactions. So it's clear that for this low cloud parameter, there's a very large main effect and also quite a large interaction for skill score, whereas for x9, it's mostly the main effect. And if you add these together, you'll see that we have, at least 50% of the variance in skill score that's explained by just these two parameters. So if you're a model developer, then this can help you to actually kind of focus your attention on, which are the most important single parameters in the model that explain a large amount of variance in the outputs in SS. For the climate sensitivity, the story was slightly different, although it's the same two parameters, x5 and x9, that are coming out as important. Here, the main effects were much more important than the nonlinear interactions, which is interesting. And x9, this parameter that relates to deep convection, turns out to be the single most important factor in this version of the model for explaining variations in climate sensitivity. So this gives you some information about the kind of close relationship between clouds, convection, and climate sensitivity. And the paper that I showed you by Zelinka with the spread in the CMIP5 and CMIP6 models also talks about the role of clouds and the feedbacks associated with clouds as being important for climate sensitivity. So this is something that's gaining a lot of attention right now in regards to the CMIP6 ensemble of models. Okay, I think this is my last slide for the first case study. And what's being shown here, if we focus just on this image on the right, which shows the density curves for the full distribution of 350 cases with the black curve. So this is the estimated density or distribution of climate sensitivities in the 350 training cases. The gray shading underneath is the estimate of the density from the emulated set. So that's 100,000 cases. We can emulate basically as many cases as we want. And then the red curve here shows the value of using this emulation approach and constraining the emulator with some kind of independent information. In this case, we use the skill score as a means of constraining the full distribution of 10,000 cases. And we call this red curve the plausible cases. So the ones in the gray curve, essentially, this includes all 100,000 cases, regardless of whether or not their climate was actually plausible or reasonable. When we constrain to only those cases where the skill score is highest, meaning that it's most plausible, then we get the red curve. And so what you can see is that this red curve actually eliminates a fairly large chunk of the distribution from the cases that had all emulated cases. So in other words, we're kind of ruling out some of the highest climate sensitivities through this method. And the default model is shown with this green line. And the main sort of scientific take home from this can be considered when you sort of mark onto this plot the blue line, and I've just sketched this on in PowerPoint, this wasn't on the original figure. The blue line shows you the spread in this same measure of climate sensitivity, lambda, from all of the models in the CMIP5 ensemble. And actually this upper bound goes to 0.87, so it's way off the edge of this figure here. So the conclusion here is that we're able to explain through variations in parameters a portion, I mentioned it was sort of somewhere in the region of 20 or 25% of the spread in the full model ensemble, but that the full model ensemble has a larger spread. And so there are things, in our conclusions, what we said was that there are things other than just the parameters that are explaining variations in climate sensitivity. And this we refer to generally in the climate science community as structural uncertainty. You can think of it in the blood pressure analogy as being the genetic makeup of the climate models, right? So the different choices that have been made in selecting particular modules or parameterization schemes for things like clouds and convection. Okay, maybe I'll pause at that point and just ask if there are any immediate questions in response to anything that I've said so far. Of course, there'll be time for discussion at the end as well, but just in case there are some immediate comments. I can't see the hands, Ankush, but maybe you can monitor those. Yes.
So when you were talking about sensitivity and comparing different parameters, but of course all of these have different units, so they have to be normalized, right? I mean, it's a multivariable problem. So my question is, you know, how arbitrary is that normalization?
Well, so the physical quantities have different units, you're right. So I can skip back, for example, to this figure, right? We can see all of the different outputs here that all have different units. Now, when we incorporate the information into our skill score SS, right? So the actual information that's being used to evaluate the emulators is SS. Now, when we incorporate the information into SS, each of these variables is contributing equally to that SS. We made the decision, you know, not to weight one particular variable more than another, and
okay.
And the normalization, I'm not sure that it's a big factor in this context, because the emulation is being done on SS, so it's not necessarily being done on the individual variables. Maybe I'm not explaining particularly well, but you know, each variable, we're comparing the skill of we're calculating a value of SS for each realization of the model, and there are 350 realizations, and it's the SS value that's being emulated. It's not the individual quantities.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And SS is a sort of a bounded quantity by definition. So I don't think the normalization is necessarily playing a role. Like you're asking, you know, if it was done differently, would we get different answers? I don't think so in this case, because we didn't try to emulate the individual outputs.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm happy to chat a bit more about that. I think I need to think about it a bit more. But my first impression is, because we were doing the emulation on SS, that it shouldn't make a big difference.
Yeah, we can talk more at 2 o'clock.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, any other quick comments or?
I had a question actually, Mr. Ankur.
Yep.
So you talked about the 2 Kelvin variation as a proxy for simulating the future in some sense, right?
Yes.
But that's ocean temperature. So like, is there any significant or non-trivial change to topology or geography of the area that you're considering under question to have any major effect on model prediction, or do you think that can be ignored?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the one part that is ignored is the land temperature change, right? The land temperature response in the what's called the SES experiment. Yeah, so we sort of impose this uniform warming in the ocean only, and the land has to respond, right? The land model is kind of free to respond. It's difficult, it turns out, to prescribe the temperature over the land in an Earth system model experiment. So so there is some uncertainty introduced by that. However, you know, the general thinking is that that is small compared to the impact that the ocean temperature has on this quantity ECS. So those land temperature variations are kind of second order effect, it turns out.
Okay.
I think there's just there's a surface area argument, right? There's just more area that's ocean, but it's also where the surface area is as well, because you could actually get quite I will say, a large proportion of the response you could reproduce by just prescribing the temperatures in the tropical band of the ocean. I see. So between sort of plus and minus 30, when there's even an even higher proportion of ocean to land. So really, yeah, these types of large-scale climate responses are driven by tropical oceans essentially.
Okay, and I'm just curious, but is there any way at the moment to simulate things like human intervention and industrialization, those kinds of effects on these models, or no?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
So the way that that's done, I mean, human intervention, like we're using Earth system models to study what used to be called geoengineering, right? So these ideas of changing the amount of solar radiation that's incident on Earth's surface in various ways, various levels of sophistication. So you can use these models for that type of approach. There's also land surface carbon capture storage type experiments that can be done. Often what you have to do is to kind of introduce those measures by proxy. You have to kind of put something in the model that affects carbon in a semi-realistic way. But yes, you can use the models for that type of thing.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, very good. Thanks for the questions. So yeah, just in the last kind of 5 or 10 minutes then, I'd like to talk about the second study. And this is one I alluded to earlier, where we've tried to take this approach, the emulation approach, forward by instead of considering just the annual global average of outputs from the Earth system model, instead to think about the full spatial representation of the climate system, and to do the emulation in a multivariate way, which we think has made some progress using a convolutional neural network approach. So just to sort of formulate this problem again, we would now like to represent this this kind of capital Y of X now, where we're dealing with a multivariate set of related spatially resolved outputs. Okay, so the outputs are a function of latitude, longitude, and then in this case we have 7 different output variables. Something to do with radiation, we have precipitation, cloud amount, etc. So we have 7 variables in our kind of output vector here, and each of them is a function of latitude and longitude, so representing the full kind of global map as shown in this illustration on the right. We also, to make this problem even richer and a bit more interesting, have run the Earth system model at different spatial resolutions. So in other words, with different grid sizes, different mesh sizes. So a lower resolution model has fewer grid boxes that are larger. A higher resolution model, like the one shown at the top here, have more grid boxes that are smaller. And there is a computational efficiency, of course, that can be derived from running the model at lower resolution because you're doing far fewer calculations. There's actually a factor of 16 speed up when we go from a 4x5 resolution, which is sort of 4 degrees by 5 degrees, quite low resolution, large grid boxes as shown in the lower right here, to a 1 by 1 degree, which is the one shown at the top here. So we have ensembles of simulations with perturbed parameters at these 3 different resolutions, and we have a multi-dimensional output space. And so what we're interested in doing is making an emulator, in this case using a convolutional neural network that can take variations in those 9 parameters as input and can output this complete function, capital Y, as a function of those uncertain parameters. Okay, so here's the set of simulations described again. So it's basically, most of the details are very similar to what we did before. The parameters were the same as before. The only difference being that we now have 100, a sample size of 100 for each of 3 different resolutions. F09 is the highest resolution, that's the 1 degree model, F19 and F45. Okay, so and the spatial grid of the 1 degree model is a 192 by 288 grid. Okay, so that's the array size of one global map of the output of the high resolution model. So that's our target. This is the architecture that for the CNN that Will McNally designed, and my understanding from computer vision is that usually you would sort of start with the image here on the right, with all its complexity and all its channels, and then you would through a series of convolutions, basically transposing this image to sort of progressively simplify it from right to left, so that you could do something like identifying whether or not your image contained an animal or a kitchen utensil or something, right? So obviously for sort of classification type problems in computer vision, this is quite common. So what Will did, which was quite novel, I think, is to actually invert that process and say, well, no, we're starting with the simple information. We're starting with the 9-dimensional parameters. And what we would like to do from those 9D parameters is to actually output the full spatial maps of however many variables, in this case 7, we're interested in. And so he's designed and implemented this CNN to do exactly that. And so we use the training data in order to basically learn this mapping of parameters onto outputs. Okay, we implement this in a training validation framework. So we have 100 samples, for example, at the highest resolution, and we would take a random sample of 80 of them to train the model, and then use the trained CNN to predict the 20 that were left out, and then we would sort of resample. We'd do that multiple times. We should say that the CNN is being used to predict the differences in the simulated output that can be attributed to the changes in the parameters. So for each combination of parameters, and we have 100 combinations, there is a perturbed version of the model. That's the one with the perturbed parameters. And what we do is take the difference in the simulation of the perturbed simulation from we subtract the default. That's the model with its default parameters. So each time we're using the CNN to predict differences as opposed to the full field. So there is a normalization. This relates, I think, to the previous question that we had. So there's a normalization to essentially have everything scaled between 0 and 1 for computational reasons. And there's a loss function. So the CNN is trained to minimize a particular loss function. Usually an MSE, a mean squared error, in the outputs is used as the target. In this case, we actually use our SS as well, because we have this sort of spatially aware skill score that has information about the spatial correlation, the spatial variance structure of the outputs. We use that as the target. So we're actually trying to sort of maximize the skill of our predicted outputs. And
sorry, Chris,
find
there's a question from Jay Thornton. Jay, do you want to
please,
ask?
Go ahead. Yep.
Sorry, had to unmute. Chris, I wonder if this process is sort of an upsampling process, does it also have access to the high resolution world map of just the landforms and the altitudes, which would be available?
That's a good question. That information is certainly available, but we did not introduce that as a covariate. And instead what we did was just use the output from the high resolution simulation, which of course would have been run using that high resolution topography. But we were actually interested in whether or not there is a relationship across scales in the outputs from the model. So for example, we're asking a question, and I'll show this in a moment what the results are, but we're asking a question of whether or not the precipitation pattern, like the spatial map of precipitation run at the 4x5 resolution, the very coarse resolution, whether there is information in that map that is useful for understanding how the same parameters would affect the pattern of precipitation at 1 degree resolution. And that's an interesting sort of scientific question. It's also a very interesting computational question, because obviously it's much cheaper to run the low resolution model. So what we end up arguing here is that you can actually make major computational efficiency gains in your sort of tuning and calibration process by running more instances of the low resolution model, which seems to contain some interesting and relevant information for the high resolution cases.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so just the short answer to your question is we did not include the sort of high resolution topography as a covariate. If you were doing something like downscaling, I mentioned that right at the beginning, like if you were just taking the output from a low resolution simulation and trying to somehow sort of transform it to a higher resolution grid, then that's what you would do. You would definitely use the high res landform as a covariate there. But in this case, we have some outputs from the high resolution model to introduce to our model to show it some examples to the CNN of what the high resolution precipitation looks like. And it turns out that the combination of those few high resolution cases and lots of the low resolution cases provides good information to the CNN to make high resolution predictions. So I'll show that right now. Yeah, no problem. Okay, so we did compare these two loss functions, and it turns out that this one using the skill score is actually better, and it's quite a benefit. Okay, this is to sort of set the scene. This is just showing you what the predictions look like against the ground truth. So now we're able to predict full global maps, and with one iteration of the CNN, we predict all of the outputs. Here's just two of them. The top field is the top row shows the top of atmosphere energy flux residuals. This is just the balance of the energy in the model, and the lower row is precipitation. And this is just for one sort of randomly selected case from our set of 20, just to sort of show you that the ground truth here on the left, this is the actual simulation from the model. And then we've got two different flavors of prediction from the CNN, one that's targeted to the mean squared error loss and one that's targeted to the SS loss. And sort of at first glance, you think, oh, well, these are actually quite similar. But what you'll note is we've actually calculated a skill score for these maps. And so this one with the MSE loss is 0.61. This one for the SS loss is 0.81. So there's actually a fairly sizable benefit from using SS loss. And this is just for one case, but that continues actually through the whole ensemble. And when you stare at the details of this, you actually realize why. So for example, this is the truth of the precipitation over the tropical Atlantic. You can see there's this sort of separation between north and southern hemisphere. In the MSE loss that doesn't really know anything about spatial structure of the output, it's all kind of blended together. Whereas in the one that's trained on the SS loss that does know about the spatial structure of the outputs, we get a much better separation. So the argument that we're putting forward here is that the skill score based loss function, which is spatially aware, is very important when you're using the CNN to predict these kind of geophysical fields that actually have some some important spatial structure. Okay, so that's just a sort of a quick example of what the CNN can do. Oh, this was just zooming in. I'm going to skip over this one. And but the real benefit of this approach, as I just alluded to in the discussion that we had a moment ago, is that we can take advantage of our multi-resolution ensemble. So we have 4 by 5 degrees simulations, very cheap, very inexpensive to run. We have 100 of those. We have a sort of intermediate resolution. We also have 100 of those. And then we have these sort of high resolution cases that are very expensive, and sort of we want to run as few of these as possible. And so we replicated an analysis that was done by colleagues at Lawrence Livermore, Anderson, and Lucas. And we define this number of high resolution cases, NHR, and we train a CNN using all of the low res cases and a progressively increasing number of high res cases, high res examples. And then we use that model to predict 20 unseen high res cases. Okay, and these are the results that we get from that analysis. And the predictions from the CNN as a function of the number of high resolution cases, and we're showing the skill of those predictions now. The prediction from the CNN is shown in blue. And so you'll see this is for the mean of all variables, and then we show 2 variables, the net radiation and precipitation. So for the mean of all variables, first of all, when there are no high resolution cases at all, so the model has not seen an example of high resolution output, the skill is not 0, right? It's far from 0. In fact, it's about sort of 0.55 on our skill score metric here. In other words, the low resolution cases are providing a significant amount of information to the CNN about what the high resolution solution should look like. But, perhaps unsurprisingly, but it's nice to see this, the information and the skill of the model increases basically linearly as you increase the number of high resolution examples that the model sees, the CNN, up to about 40. And once you've hit 40, you essentially plateau. You don't really increase very much more. So 40 seems to be an important number of examples. And the most important thing is that 40 is a lot smaller than 100. So this is one of the things that we're arguing in the paper, is that what we're showing here is that you can actually get away with running relatively few high resolution cases if you've run a suitably large number of the low resolution cases to provide your model with training examples. The last point I want to make is that this skill, this was the average skill on the left, is not uniform for all different outputs. So the net radiation is quite a sort of uniform field. It doesn't have a huge amount of spatial structure. You see that with 0 high resolution cases, the skill is actually a bit better than the average, right? And it doesn't even increase that much. For something like precipitation, which is sort of the holy grail of high resolution modeling, it's clear that with no high resolution information, the model struggles a bit, right? So the skill is down below 0.4, but it does continue to increase, and it increases quite steeply as high resolution cases are introduced. I just wanted to mention very quickly that we sort of struggled with how to have a suitable baseline against which to reference the skill of the CNN. You'll notice that there's this orange line, which we're calling the mean baseline. We sort of wrestled with this idea of using a different model, like a Gaussian process or a random forest, or a sort of less sophisticated machine learning model to provide a baseline. But what we found was that none of those methods would actually do the same thing as what the CNN was doing, which is to predict this multivariate spatially resolved output with a single model. So it was not particularly easy to find a reference. Instead, what we did was we took the approach that is very commonly used in climatology, which is that you would test your prediction against a very much more simple prediction. So in this case, we test against the prediction that each year, or rather each combination of parameters, would produce a a prediction that was basically the climatological mean, so the average of all years, or the expected precipitation or radiation response, and that's what's shown in this orange line. So it's clear that, you know, even just predicting the mean has some skill, right? Even for precipitation. In fact, for precipitation, the baseline is very close to the CNN model with a small number of cases, but with about 10 or definitely at 20 cases, the CNN model has emerged from and is better than just using the climatological average to predict the impact of parameters on the simulation. Okay, I'm going to conclude at this point because I know we've gone 2 o'clock and I want to leave time for some more conversation. So what I would say is that, you know, we've offered what I think is some potential toward making this process of calibration of the model more efficient. However, in order to really, you know, move this from emulation to calibration, really requires doing more with the uncertainty. So the Gaussian process method that I mentioned in the very first example has this beautiful property of being able to provide an estimate of its own uncertainty. The CNN, as implemented here in this analysis, does not. And what we're doing right now is exploring with Ankush and with Gordon, and also in conversations with others, about how we can make this CNN process more probabilistic, a bit like the Gaussian process, so that we can get a proper estimate of uncertainties, which I think will enable us to make progress with the calibration problem. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to conclude. These are my contact details, and I would welcome questions from anyone who's watching the video afterwards and wasn't able to participate in the live discussion. I'd like to thank Will McNally and Jack Virgin, PhD students at Waterloo, for their help with this work as well. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. So thank you, and happy to have a discussion and questions.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for that wonderful talk. There's a couple of questions. Oh, Matt. Yeah, go for it, Matt.
Hi. So I wasn't clear, what's the role of historical data in all this? Presumably you could use the machine learning model to correct a physical model toward historical data, or at least use historical data to validate one versus the other. Does it play a role at all?
Absolutely, yeah, that's a really good question. So you're absolutely right. When we're thinking about calibration, that is when historical data, observations, become the target, right? Because your goal should be to calibrate your model toward truth, right? Really, that's what we're striving for, and our estimate of truth, albeit with some observational uncertainty, would be historical observations. In both of the studies that I have shown here today, we have not used historical observations. So when you introduce historical observations, it further complicates this, which is an already fairly complicated problem. And so we took the decision that at this kind of proof of concept phase, we would keep observations out of this. But I'm working with 2 other students now on follow-ups to both of the studies that I mentioned here today that do include observations, and so that will be the sort of next step toward calibration. We took the decision here, instead of using observations as the reference, instead to use the default version of the model, so the version that's run with the default parameters. And so what we're measuring here in terms of the difference in the perturbed versus default model is, you know, how far away from its default state do the parameter variations push the model. So that's I would say, quite a different question to, you know, what combination of parameters move the model towards observations. That's the next question that we need to address.